All right, so let's begin. Welcome everyone joining us around Australia to this, both in person and online, this public panel on the topic Marxism and Anarchism, Radical Ideologies Today, hosted by the Melbourne chapter of the Platypus Affiliated Society. My name is Ryan Minkler and I'll be the moderator for this event. This is the fourth Platypus panel ever hosted in Melbourne on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and we thank the audience for being in attendance. We're coming to you from historic Trades Hall in Melbourne, one of the first trades halls ever in the world, built in the late 1850s. And just for information, the toilets are out in the main hall through there and then to the right. The Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006 in Chicago, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism based on problems and tasks inherited from the old left of the 1920s and 1930s, the new left of the 1960s and 1970s, and the post-political left of the 80s and 90s, all for the possibility of emancipatory politics today. You can learn about our activities on Facebook, Instagram through Platypus Melbourne, or visiting our website, www.platypus1917.org. We also have a podcast titled Shit Platypus Says, which can be streamed on SoundCloud, and our monthly international open access publication called the Platypus Review. You'll find plenty of copies available on the table over there, free to take as many as you like. Platypus Melbourne also runs a reading group where we go through a yearly syllabus from Rousseau to Marx to Lenin to Adorno, trying to understand what Marxism was. This reading group starts next week. There are two streams running concurrently. One stream meets in person at the Clyde and on Thursdays, just in Carlton, and the other on Wednesday nights on Zoom for Australia-wide participation. The panel topic for today is Marxism and Anarchism, Radical Ideologies Today, and the panelists have been asked to respond to the following prompt. It seems that there are still only two radical ideologies, anarchism and Marxism. They emerged out of the same crucible, the Industrial Revolution, the unsuccessful revolutions of 1848 and 1871, a weak liberalism, the centralization of state power, the rise of the workers' movement, and the promise of socialism. They are the revolutionary heritage, and all significant radical upsurges of the last 150 years have returned to mine their meaning with the current situation. In this respect, our current moment seems no different. The millennial left has seemed to fluctuate between the two, taking inspiration on the one hand from the anarchism of David Graeber, for example, during an Occupy, while on the other hand, looking to the Marxism of David Harvey and Michael Heinrich to make sense of the crisis of neoliberalism. The turn to neo-social democracy, exemplified by the Sanders and Corbyn moments, was sometimes opposed as electoralism by anarchists and sometimes opposed as reformism by Marxists, at the same time as often finding critical support from representatives from both camps. Finally, there have been attempts to leave the grounds of these two theories entirely, but these often seem either to land right back in one of the camps or to remain marginal. To act today, we seek to draw up the balance sheet of the 20th century. The historical experience concentrated in these two radical ideologies must be unfurled if they are to serve as compass points. To see in what ways their return in our current moment represents an authentic engagement with the past, and in what ways the return of a ghost. Where have the battles left us? What forms do we have for meeting, theoretically and practically, the problems of our present? That ends the prompt. Our format is simple. Each of the four speakers will have around 10 minutes for opening remarks, then 4 to 5 minutes each after everyone has spoken to respond to the fellow panelists for an hour or so of audience Q&A. If time permits, we'll also take questions from the Zoom audience. For the Q&A, I hope to only call on questions. If you in the audience have more of a comment, then I encourage you to work it into a short piece of writing as a response and submit it to the Platypus for review, where we can potentially publish it along with the transcript in the coming months. And our speakers for today, read out in agreed upon speaking order, are Matthew Crossan, is a member of the Melbourne Anarchist Communist Group. He has been an anarchist for nearly 10 years and is currently a warehouse worker and writes about revolutionary socialist politics. He advocates the historically dominant form of anarchism, this being a politics of intervention in the class struggle, as well as a theory of libertarian social revolution. Lachlan Marshall is a member of Solidarity, which is part of the International Socialist Tendency. He first got involved in politics through the campaign against the Northern Territory intervention and refugee rights. He now works in the disability sector and is an Australian Services Union member and workplace delegate. Benjamin Smith is a member of the Anarcho-syndicalism Federation. He is an instructional designer who has done all the usual academic things. He is currently chipping away at a dissertation on romanticism and its re-emergence in post-Marxist social theory. Tom Griffiths is a former central committee of the Communist Party of Australia, Marxist-Leninist, who apparently expelled himself in 1976 after the Gang of Four episode. He remains an unreconstructed Marxist, meaning unrepentantly old-fashioned, in the Maoist tradition, and since that time has worked as a family and group therapist in mainstream former refugee and Indigenous settings. The event will conclude in under 3 hours before 4 p.m, at which point you're invited us to join us at the curtain across the road, where we'll continue the conversation. You can speak to some of the panelists in their name. With that, I hand it over to Matthew, who will begin his opening remarks. Matthew?
Thanks, and thanks everyone for coming. Just to start off by saying that though I am involved with the Anarchist Communist Group, I'm speaking here in a personal capacity, so my remarks shouldn't be necessarily taken as reflecting official positions. We've been asked to speak about the relevance of anarchism and Marxism, struggle today, and the ways in which they differ. This is an interesting time for revolutionary politics. Many activists have become disillusioned with movements like Occupy, with electoral politics, and have become frustrated by the limits of riots. I think it's important to note that in finding themselves in this position, they join the masses of working people who are mostly anti-political in this sense of politics. How anarchism or Marxism can be relevant to them, and not just the self-consciously political, is the most important thing for us to consider. Before I go on, I need to clarify that the anarchism that I'm referring to is specifically the historically dominant current of mass anarchism, sometimes known as social anarchism or class struggle anarchism. It is the libertarian wing of revolutionary socialism, which puts at its centre of its practice the self-managed, direct struggle of workers against bosses, with a revolutionary horizon consisting of the expropriation of property and the forceful defence of that transformation. In respect to Marxism, I also need to clarify that I will be using a narrow definition. To outline the main historic splits with anarchism, I'll be referring only to the political strategy advocated by Marx and Engels during their lifetimes. Marx's critique of political economy was uncontroversially praised by anarchists like Bakunin and Cafiero at the time, and countless other anarchists have since done the same, and I include
Maybe just hold the microphone a little further away from now.
Yep. In fact, it's not difficult to find Marxists who reject far more of Marxist analysis than Bakunin ever did. The fact that no one would argue that this made Bakunin a Marxist eliminates the critique of political economy from our consideration of Marxism's relevance. Another thing to consider is how we should talk about the various post-Marx Marxisms. For me, the question of their relevance is simple to answer, to the degree that their practice converges with anarchism as parts of the council communist tradition and ultra-left have. The label becomes somewhat irrelevant to me. Such Marxisms can offer a theoretical framework and organisational practice which people should take seriously and engage with. For instance, I consider the Angry Workers of the World Collective in London to be undertaking one of the most interesting and admirable approaches to organising currently going on. Though they have shown themselves to be open to anarchist ideas, their background is clearly in Marxism. Despite this, their approach of encouraging workplace action by taking jobs in strategically interesting sectors of the economy, circulating news of struggles relevant to their co-workers, and coordinating their activity through an explicitly communist collective, essentially mimics the anarchist strategy of dual organisation, the parallel construction of a specifically revolutionary organisation of militants, and an intervention in existing struggles through the organisational forms which make rank-and-file direct action possible. Still, I contend that anarchism in particular is still of relevance today, and so I want to touch on two key contributions before turning to how they relate to the failures of the Marxist political program. Firstly, anarchism offers an understanding of how we can achieve desperately needed reforms without being a reformist movement. This aspect of anarchist theory is rooted in a materialist analysis of the state and its historic function, as well as a detailed historical analysis of how social changes occurred. The insight provided is that the advancement of our class interests isn't and has never been driven by good or bad politicians, ideas, or legislation, but is instead the result of shifts in the balance of class forces, meaning the level of capacity held by an independent, countervailing force to disrupt production and threaten the realisation of profit. It follows that the more essential an industry is to overall capital accumulation, the more potential leverage held by workers of that industry, not only within the specific enterprise, but over governments, which exist to serve the long-term interests of capitalism as a system, and in turn reproduce their own privileged position of power. Secondly, anarchism offers a libertarian theory of social revolution. It offers the crucial insight that a real transformation of production to a system of communist self-management requires that there be self-management within the struggle itself, and the destruction rather than the capture of governmental power, which is to be replaced by a federation of committees, councils, whatever other organisational form workers' power happens to take. Both of these contributions by anarchist theory continue to be of enormous importance and are distinct from the Marxist alternative, the many failures of which have vindicated the anarchist critique. But what did Marx and Engels advocate? Certainly both were in favour of class struggle, just like anarchists, but there are some key points of divergence in terms of the tactics employed in day-to-day struggle and the strategy proposed as a means for achieving social revolution. For instance, though it is downplayed by more radical Marxists, Marx and Engels insisted that workers' associations form political parties committed, where possible, to campaigning in elections and taking seats in parliament. Primarily, Marx indicated that this should be done so that communist parties could put forward the communist position and side with workers' interests as a means of propaganda. There is some ambiguity here, though, given comments by Marx, which suggests that the potential for peaceful transitions to communism, particularly in advanced democratic republics. Notably, Engels described the democratic republic as the form necessary for the dictatorship of the proletariat. Marx also described it as being the form of government in which it's possible to eliminate bureaucracy, which should, I think, make anyone question his understanding of that concept. Marx and Engels also advocated centralised structure within organisations of class struggle. Despite some comments within the Civil War in France, which seem to suggest otherwise, the reality is that the two of them favoured representation over delegation, with the capacity for leadership bodies, such as democratically elected executive committees or central councils, to break with the position of their constituents, determine policy, and impose those policies on the rank and file. This was a major fight within the First International that led to the split with the proto-anarchist faction and ultimately the death of the organisation. And though a close reading is necessary to cut through conflicting Marxist definitions of the state, Marx obfuscates whether the state refers to an act of revolution or a centralised apparatus of government which maintains class rule. What Marx advocated in terms of revolutionary struggle was the need for a transitional workers' government composed of representatives of the revolutionary parties. The state apparatus was seen as necessary for the victory of the revolution, and that it would vanish with the end of class conflict, giving way to the same kind of society envisioned by anarchist communists. Turning to the record of implementation, we find that Marx and Engels' program failed in precisely the ways that was predicted by anarchists. Even the seemingly benign policy of using parliaments as a platform for communist propaganda gradually produced social democratic parties of an ordinary kind, leading them to become appendages of the capitalist state. This is not a question of corruption or betrayal, but rather systemic imperatives and institutional logics, which cannot be overcome by even the most radical of politicians. As for the formation of so-called worker states, here we don't need to turn to the USSR or China, as some might expect. It suffices to look at Marx's favourite example of the Paris Commune, which, despite some confusion around this, maintained a government in the traditional sense, and so was, by definition, incapable of carrying out the necessary socialisation of property required in any real revolution. In fact, the communal council stifled the revolutionary activity of the Parisian masses with its increasing centralisation and bureaucratic model of revolution by decree. The real revolutionary movement in Paris was in the burgeoning workers' associations, the proliferation of popular clubs, and in the workers arming themselves. However, these workers sacrificed their revolutionary project the more that, like Marx, they saw the communal council as a real lever of socialist transformation. Workers flooded their supposed delegates, which were in reality autonomous authorities, with petitions to legalise their proposals. The council became overwhelmed by this legalistic process and little by little became removed from the stalling struggles over the question of property. The final days of the Commune saw any hope of further rupture vanish with the consolidation of power in a Committee of Public Safety. This is the nature of all states, whether they have smashed the old state machinery or not. The recognition of this by anarchists is still of supreme relevance to anyone who still considers a real social revolution possible and necessary. To wrap up, I want to reiterate that these important contributions by anarchist theory can only be made really relevant if we, as militants, are actively organising amongst ourselves, developing a shared understanding of existing conditions, amplifying our efforts, coordinating activity, and involving ourselves in the concrete struggles of the working class as they emerge. We should be encouraging their best elements of instinctive radicalism, pushing the struggles as far as they will go, sharing news of action across workplaces, and all with an eye towards propagating our revolutionary analysis and horizon. And with that, I'll leave things there. Thanks.
Thank you. Lachlan.
Thank you. Is that good distance? Yep. Yeah, I'll start by acknowledging that we're meeting on Aboriginal land, paying my respects to elders past, present and emerging. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And, I think that's a good starting point for a discussion like this. Before 1788, there was no state on this continent. There were no class divisions or exploitation. Indigenous people.
Just a backup. Should I use this?
No, that's just backup.
Oh, okay.
There were no bosses. Basically, people exercised collective control over their work and their relationship with the world around them. And I think probably all of us agree on the need to create a society that, shares some of those sorts of principles. We think it's both necessary and possible. Because, you look at the way capitalism is operating now, really we're not going to have a planet to live on if it continues the way it's going. Escalating imperialist war with the permanent threat of nuclear war, climate chaos, ecological collapse, and the pandemics that are associated with the environmental crisis. All of those things, I think, really, convince me that we need revolutionary change. Revolution that takes control away from the capitalist class and brings our society under the control of, workers and other oppressed people. I think Marxism is a vital tool in this process. Because if we boil down Marxism to a single principle, I think it's that the emancipation of the working class is the act of the working class itself. That's what Marx himself said. And basically that means socialism from below, through revolution, where workers smash the capitalist state and build their own form of class power based on institutions of grassroots democracy. What it doesn't mean is socialists, winning elections to parliament and introducing socialism that way, or small groups of revolutionaries, conquering state power and implementing socialism on behalf of the working class or the masses. As we saw in China in 1949 or in Cuba 10 years later. There's probably agreement here on the need for revolution. As Matt sort of outlined, what we probably disagree is on the role of revolutionaries in revolutions, amongst other things. Principally around our attitude to the state, the need for organisation or a revolutionary party. Now, I guess what's the Marxist theory of the state? Well, the state, appears in history with the emergence of class divisions, basically, and the need of a ruling class to preserve its interests and protect itself against the classes that it exploits. Now, the state isn't a neutral instrument that can be taken over by workers and used to implement socialist measures. That was, a conclusion Marx came to after the Paris Commune. The state we live under today is a capitalist state and exists to shore up the rule of the capitalist class. This understanding comes from the historical experience of the workers' movement. Just briefly on the Paris Commune, got a slightly different interpretation to Matt, because I think that did show how it was the first example of how the working class can create an alternative to the capitalist state. But before the Paris Commune, Marx and Engels didn't really know what would replace the capitalist state. They had vague sort of comments about working class, organising itself as the ruling class. But it was the Parisian workers who really gave that concrete expression. So basically, after the Paris Commune, the Communist Manifesto was revised, and the new preface said, "One thing especially was proved by the Commune, that the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes." Unlike later Marxists who believed that capitalism could be gradually reformed through Parliament and the institutions of the state, Marx was clear that the working class needed to create an alternative form of class rule. What was this, first workers' state? What did it look like? For starters, it was thoroughly democratic. So all public officials were elected and subject to immediate recall. So they were accountable to the people who elected them. Workers' representatives were paid an average skilled workers' wage to discourage careerism and prevent the formation of a privileged layer of bureaucrats. Most importantly, in some ways, is the way that the Commune didn't have a separate standing army that was against the population, but the state, in a way, was the whole population because it was armed. But the working class was armed. There were workers' militias. There wasn't an external coercive force in that respect. Workers were, integrally involved in running the state. Now, during its brief time in power, it did things like hand over to workers the workplaces that had been shut by the employers, banned night work in the bakeries, provided pensions for widows, handed over hotels to homeless people, etc. It wasn't a top-down exercise. There were daily mass meetings of thousands of workers that representatives of the Commune had to, face up to and account for themselves to. The banning of night work in the bakeries wasn't just some idea that came from the intellectuals in the Commune. It was because thousands of bakers actually marched on the headquarters of the Commune to demand it, and the council had to do that. So I suppose what's important to point out is that while the Commune was a thoroughly democratic, democratic in its structure, I suppose a workers' state is only as democratic as the mass of the population is mobilised, participating in all the activities of running that society, and is putting demands on the state. And I think that was true as well of the Russian Revolution and its ultimate sort of degeneration into dictatorship, because in Russia, slightly differently, right? The workers took power through workers' councils or Soviets, and they were able to win over the peasant majority and defeat the counter-revolutionary armies of the old order and over a dozen imperialist armies. Can I just ask, is someone timing me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Tell me when I'm going to.
Yeah, I'll give you 1 or 2 minutes.
Thanks, cool. What made the Russian Revolution different to really any other revolution since the Paris Commune or in the 20th century was a revolutionary party that was had a mass base, was able to gain a majority of support in the most important institutions of working class power, the Soviets, and essentially smash the capitalist state and win over the majority of people to build an alternative form of power. a government based on workers' councils. All right, what else? I suppose it's a very long story, but because the revolution didn't spread beyond Russia, which was always what the success of the Russian Revolution was based on, because it didn't spread to Germany above all, more industrialized countries that could have basically rescued Russia from the terrible backwardness of its economy. Ultimately, the workers' state was isolated and terribly weakened by the Civil War. That basically completely decimated the working class through war itself, famine, starvation. The working class, halved in size. In Petrograd, only a third of its 1917. In Petrograd, only a third of its 1917 number existed at the end of the. It existed at the end of the Civil War. So basically, without the working class to actually maintain that democratic nature of the state, as you saw, at least a lot of the time in the Paris Commune in 1917, it was inevitable that the workers' state in Russia was going to degenerate into what we saw into a Stalinist dictatorship. Now, I guess I'll just wrap up by saying that revolutionary organisation isn't only necessary during revolution. I think we can see it's of immediate relevance in places like Sudan and Sri Lanka, where the need to build an alternative to the capitalist state confronts activists every day. But also here in Australia, I think we need to bring revolutionaries and activists from different struggles together, to learn from each other, be more effective in spreading our ideas, and relate our different struggles to the fight for socialism. I might just leave it there.
Hello, and thank you to the Platypus Affiliated Society for the invitation to participate. It's good to be here, but also strange to be here, given the sometimes cooperative, often antagonistic, and occasionally murderous relationship between anarchism and Marxism. As Ryan said, I'm from the Anarcho-syndicalism Federation, which was founded in 1986 and became the Australian section of the International Workers' Association in 1989. We are, however, not the first IWA section to have a presence in Australia. In 1956, an exile section of the Bulgarian CNT was established in Sydney, the members of which fought a guerrilla campaign against the occupying German forces in World War II. They had to flee Bulgaria, however, in 1945 because the Red Army, as it pushed westwards, was actively hunting down and executing any anarchists they caught. The Bulgarians were joined in Australia by other members of the IWA in 1965. This group of 21 families comprised members of the Spanish CNT who had been living in North Africa since the end of the Spanish Civil War. And you'll all be familiar with the tensions between anarchists and Marxists as they fought alongside each other during that conflict. Both of these groups contributed members to the founding of the ASF in 1986, and it is what we've learned from them that makes us what we are today. So that's who we are and where we're from. I mention this for two reasons. Firstly, because the tension between anarchist and Marxist has a direct bearing on our own organisation and its origin. And secondly, to sound a counter-note to the way that this event has been framed, where our platypus hosts have described the present situation in terms of discontinuity, rebirth, and resurgence. Our perspective is one of continuity, long struggle, and depth of institutional memory. Now, before I go into detail about how we see the difference between anarchism and Marxism, I'd like to add to the picture that Matt has already sketched out. As we've heard, anarchism, like Marxism, is a revolutionary movement with roots in the mid-19th century socialist project. As an idea, anarchism originated and started to develop in the 1840 writings of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon regarding the particular character that the revolutionary socialist movement should adopt. It was Proudhon's belief that to create a society that united both individual and collective liberty with an egalitarian social order, the authoritarian and centralizing strategy adopted by the Jacobins during the 1792 to 93 period of the French Revolution should not be used as a model by the revolutionary socialists of the 1840s. It was Proudhon's belief, and one we share, that a libertarian society, yet alone libertarian socialism, cannot be produced by authoritarian means. And rather than the ends justifying the means used to achieve it, it is the means that determine and condition what the end will be. Marx and Engels, as we know, took precisely the opposite attitude. For them, the Jacobin seizure of the French state's highly centralized bureaucracy ensured the means of defending and driving the revolution forward. This is a view passed down from Marx to Lenin, Trotsky, and the Bolsheviks of 1917. And they were all very keen students of the history of the French Revolution. And I don't think Marx's backsliding, made in his 1871 analysis of the Paris Commune, qualifies this strategy in any deep way. Is this difference in attitudes to the authoritarian centralizing example of the Jacobin Party that is the kernel from which arises everything that differentiates anarchist and Marxist perspectives? As we heard, it would later lead to the split of the First International and the constitution of Marxism and Anarchism as separate movements. To be clear, the Marxist model of revolution is nothing more than coup d'etat, and it is our view that the revolution of October 1917 was not a revolution, but simply a coup, resulting in the self-imposition of a new oligarchy and the institution of state capitalism. Is the anarchist view, expressed admirably by Emma Goldman, who happened to be present in Russia for the whole show, that due to the actions of the Bolshevik Party, the revolution as started in February 1917 had, by 1921, clearly failed. No doubt some of the Marxists in the room may be tempted to object and ask, failed by whose criteria? And yes, the criteria in which that judgment is based are our criteria, that is to say, anarchist criteria, which leads me to another difference in our perspectives. It has long been argued, by Lenin principally, but by others too, that the Marxists and the anarchists want the same thing, but the anarchists don't know how to get there. I don't think this is true. I don't think that we do want the same thing. We might use the same words to describe what we want, give or take a qualifying adjective or two, but I think the Marxist vision of a post-revolutionary society in which the state withers away is a fairy tale, and results in a situation very different from the anarchist vision, and not simply because the state has never shown any propensity to wither and fade of its own accord. But let's take that fairy tale at face value, if only for a moment. Let's imagine that the state gradually does wither away after the means of production are duly expanded to become a material base for a new socialist world. What does this represent if not the fading into nothing of politics as the sphere of social action? And yes, I understand that, for Marxism, politics is an epiphenomenon and a reflection of a class-based society founded on the material conditions of capitalist production. If you want to make sense of it in that way, be my guest. But you have to admit that behind all the verbiage, that view of politics is utterly reductive. Coupled to this reductivism, Marx's image of the worker as the standard bearer of a universal humanity, and you have the recipe for the Marxist totalitarianism that we all know, if not love. This recipe for totalitarianism is not the result of the material conditions of society. It is a product of ideas, and stunted ideas at that. Because historical materialism is not an alternative to philosophical idealism, but a perspective within idealism that is sensitive to the social historical conditions in which the social act of thinking about our world takes place. In contrast to Marxism, anarchism sees the revolution not as the event that ushers in the end of politics, but as the event that introduces the possibility of its full flourishing. And that is because anarchism asserts the primacy of politics as a sphere of value, contest, and meaning creation over and above the economic or technical scientific spheres. Collective and individual autonomy can only be achieved if we assert the primacy of politics over and above the 5 other value spheres of art, religion, law, economy, and the sphere of science and technology. Anarchism does this, which is why it is, in contrast to other ideologies, committed to democracy in its direct participatory form. Our idea of the revolution is to create democracy where there is none and to extend it to every institution of society. To pursue this program is to destroy both capitalism and the state. This is because, for us, democracy is either direct or not at all. In fact, it is fair to say that anarchism is founded on the insight that electoral representationalism is not, in fact, a species of democracy, but rather a form of oligarchy. And the fact that it selects leaders through the act of plebiscite changes this not one bit. Now, it's true that anarchists have not always articulated this insight in these terms, and it's worth asking why. It is my contention that Proudhon first described himself as an anarchist in 1840 because of the way in which the term democracy was used and popularly understood in both the French and English languages underwent a profound change in the half-century between the start of the French Revolution in 1789 and the time Proudhon wrote What is Property in 1840. The result was that democracy in its original, direct, participatory sense was no longer available as a linguistic and conceptual tool in quite the way it had been prior to 1790. For Marx and Engels, this linguistic change, if they ever even noticed it, was never a problem. For them, the capture of state power was to win the battle of democracy. But for Proudhon, it was a problem. Another word had to be found as he started to sketch out an alternative social vision, a vision that Bakunin and the collectivist sections of the First International would champion and continue to develop. It is that word which gives our movement its name. Thank you.
Tom, thank you.
Thank you. Is this working? How's that? Yeah, that's okay. Look, I'm going to take a slightly different take, although before I begin that take, I'd like to thank Lachlan for reminding me about a certain disquiet I have, or a disappointment, about Welcome to Country, the ritual of Welcome to Country. Because what's missing in Welcome to Country is an acknowledgement of the armed struggle that occurred right across the continent. And this, I think, is a source, should be, a source of pride amongst Indigenous people. The idea that the armed struggle was going to win was of course, always not on. That's not the point. The point is they defended their patch of turf, and that needs to be acknowledged, because pride comes from that acknowledgement. Very similar to the Irish situation. And they've had a lot more experience of British colonialism than anyone else I know. Okay, now, let me start my gig with a poem by Robert Gray. Karl Marx was playing a parlour game with his daughters. To their question, what is the quality one should most abhor, he wrote, servility. This was found on a scrap of paper amongst the family albums and letters. It is the most essential of the complete works. Now, this is so Marx, and it is an essential part of our heritage. A heritage, by the way, where our role is that of troublemaker and not to be good, staid, or boring. The heritage left by Marx and Engels is not confined to political economy, and we've heard a little bit about that, and I'm not going down that rabbit hole because 10 minutes doesn't give me long enough. So yes, but what I'm wanting to point out too is the spirit of rebelliousness. And this is a spirit not simply confined to group or class sensibility in action, but individuals standing up against oppression, swimming against the tide of dominant ideological belief and practice. You can call it what you will. Marx, of course, didn't invent rebelliousness, but through enjoining workers worldwide to identify the commonality of their interests, he took it to a higher level. The baton I see him inheriting is one passed on by Gerard Winstanley, the most radical voice of the English Revolution. And Winstanley wrote that freedom is the man who turns the world upside down, and he therefore maketh many enemies. Winstanley knew what he was talking about. And also Shelley. Men of England, heirs of glory, writers of unwritten story, shake to earth your chains like dew, that in sleep have fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few. By the late 19th century, Marx's abhorrence of civility was joined and given expression by, oddly enough, Nietzsche. The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. If you try it, you will be lonely often and sometimes frightened, but no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself. Now that comment at the end of the 19th century assumes the liberation of the self, of the individual from feudal and pre-feudal constraints. And this comment by Nietzsche is remarkably similar to those uttered by Wang Hongwen of the Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party's 10th Congress. And what he was doing there, he was elaborating on Mao's view that swimming against the tide is a revolutionary principle. And he pointed out that such a stance can risk imprisonment, expulsion from the party, or you can expel yourselves if you like, or even death. And I think we can say that he too knew what he was talking about. Revolutionary parties and movements have been much better at swimming against the external tide of the class enemy. It's part of the job description, fair enough. Although it needs pointing out that identifying ideological currents, especially those that label themselves left or even revolutionary, and figuring out whether they are fair income or rather manifestations of bourgeois ideology is another matter, and a rather important matter in my view. In other words, what Mao and Wang were getting at is that the tide that must be swum against is often internal. Marx would have agreed, having swum these waters himself many times. This is also part of our heritage, finding ourselves in the midst of currents often presenting themselves as false prophets or as the proper way to go. This aspect is too easily swept under the carpet or insufficiently understood, and it is, largely speaking, a cultural question. Culture here in the broadest sense of the term. And I'll probably touch on that again a bit later. So I want to give some examples of what I mean by this. Now, the first and the most trivial is my experience in the CPIML, and the fact that a young man in his 20s was part of the Central Committee is itself a joke. And the Central Committee, I might add, never met, at least not that I'm aware of. Now, the fact that the CPIML was the fact that we expelled ourselves because the CPIML, after the death of Mao and the arrest of the Gang of Four, did a 180-degree pivot without any discussion, is telling. We started to raise questions. What in the fuck's going on, more or less? And for this reason, we apparently expelled ourselves. Now, forget the politics of the issue, around the Cultural Revolution or whatever. That kind of internal politicking is just appalling. Another example is that of Richard Wright and his experience in the United States Communist Party. Wright was a black writer, an extraordinarily good writer. He wrote two wonderful, he wrote a memoir, Black Boy, the second part of which is titled American Hunger. Now, Wright wrote these in the early 1940s, describing his experience growing up in the Jim Crow South and then in Chicago. He fled the Jim Crow South when he was 19 and went to Chicago, like many of his friends, colleagues, associates, and he describes himself there as being lifted by the burning arms of the city. It's a very astute and important comment, because modernity is both liberating and burning. Now, what Wright did and why he became brassed off with the Communist Party, or they with him, was that on understanding that in Russia, government figures had shown genuine interest and encouragement in the backblock areas of Russia and were assisting people in these areas to become literate, to understand their culture and to value it. And Wrights thought, oh, this sounds like the perfect segue, he didn't use that word, into what black people in the South need. And what kind of reception did he get? Cold water, a lot of cold water. He was told he didn't understand. What Wright was not understanding was the need to be obedient. And Wright was not an obedient man, and good on him for that. The third example comes from China and Liu Shaoxi. Liu Shaoxi, who was one of the leaders of the Communist Party, wrote a pamphlet, book, whatever, called How to Be a Good Communist. And it's really worth a read. I find myself saying, somewhat surprisingly, well, not surprised now, but after I read it. Because what he was describing, what he was saying being a good communist meant, was to be obedient, was to cultivate self, but cultivate self in a way remarkably similar to the feudal aristocracy that had, to the bureaucracy of the feudal system in China that had been, marching on for centuries. What he was talking about, therefore, was elitism mixed with cultural drag and fraudulently presenting itself as modern and revolutionary. Now, how many? 2 minutes. That's okay, I think I can just make it. The last example I want to give is that from Rock Dalton. Dalton was an El Salvadorian communist poet, fantastic poet. For those of you who do not know his stuff, look him up and get his stuff. It's terrific. Dalton, one of Dalton's poems is called Dialectic of Genesis, Crisis and Rebirth. For you, we will not put the party on an altar, because you taught us that the party is an organisation that lives in the real world, and its sickness is the same as bankruptcy. Because of you, we know, Lenin, that the best crib for the party is fire. It's a really important point. For making comments like this, Dalton was murdered by members of his own party, who wanted to put out the fire. Dalton was arguing for the establishment of a mass base. Before you can justify being a revolutionary party, to make a revolution, you need a mass base. It would seem obvious, not to some. So this crib, is, as Wright would describe it, a nurturing environment. And it is an environment we need to value and rediscover. Thank you.
It's over here.
Okay, thanks for all your opening statements. They were very provocative. Before we pass back to responses, I'll just maybe tie in a few threads that were touched on there. I guess several of you touched on the nature of the state, and one of the things certainly both anarchists and Marxists were writing about in the 19th century was on the nature of the state and how that's tied into the nature, the project of overcoming the state in its capitalist form. So maybe just, if you have a chance to revisit the question of the state and how your politics are formed around understanding of the state. That's certainly something that came across. Anyway, we'll cross over to Matt to have responses to anyone. And also, people are free to just use the microphones to ask questions of each other during this time as well. Thank you.
Yeah, so I guess one thing that was interesting to me is that I think both Marxist speakers didn't really address anarchism at all and their thoughts on anarchism. Lachlan raised that he suspects there are differences between us about the role of revolutionaries, and specifically brought up the role of the party. But I'd be interested to know why you think there are differences there, what you think they are. There's some confusion around the idea of anarchism and also I think some confusion in Marxism about what a party is. Sometimes you'll hear a party described as just like-minded militants cooperating together with a shared analysis, a shared strategy, trying to network struggles, intervene in them all, give them a coherence and that kind of thing. There's no disagreement there with anarchist politics. In fact, anarchists used to call those kind of organisations things like parties. They would sometimes even use the word vanguard. Those were dropped because of the associations they came to take with Marxism. Where the distinction would be is that anarchists oppose a party which is substitutionist, which thinks that it should take over struggles, or that it is some kind of a government structure in waiting to take the specific institutional role of managing a state. That's where the distinction would be. I would also be interested to know from Lachlan where he's getting his history on the Paris Commune from, because to me it sounds like he's describing what Marx wrote in the Civil War in France. And the interesting thing about Civil War in France is that it's incorrect about what happened in Paris. Scholarship since then has shown that to be true. Some books I would recommend are, there's a slim documentary volume, all original documents, called Communards of Paris 1871, edited by Stuart Edwards. Also a good book called Paradise of Association by Martin Johnson. The Paris Commune did not function as mandated delegates. There were ideas talked about there should have been mandates and this kind of thing. This is really only taken seriously by the kind of Proudhonian delegates, the Blankists within that organisation, which did not take that seriously. They functioned effectively as representative authorities within a typical kind of democratic government. The police were not abolished within the Paris Commune. There was a police force. It was heavily controlled by the Blankist elements. I think there's a difficulty in talking about the Paris Commune that people will tend to go towards kind of documents that were written at the time with incomplete information, political interventions people were making, and not the actual history of what happened in Paris. Some interesting things that stood out, and what Lachlan said as well, is they talked about the communal council handing over workplaces. To me, this is a strange thing to hear from someone who says that they believe in socialism from below. This is, to me, inherently something that's been ordered from above or approved from above. To me, a politics of socialising property would be one of a direct act by the workers themselves, seizing property and taking control of it. He talks about the bakers marching on the commune, and this shows that the communal council was responsive. But yeah, sure, that's a struggle. That happens in all kinds of states. People struggle against their state. It responds because of the pressure from below. I could raise some, with Benjamin's comments, I don't actually entirely agree about what Marx's underlying politics were. I think he did have a kind of a radically libertarian conception of what communism should be, and that it was a radically individualist and libertarian idea that is converged with anarchism significantly. And I also don't think that the revolution in Russia can be reduced to a coup. It was a complex process in which the Bolshevik gradually supplanted the organs of popular power, the factory committees, peasant cooperatives, the Soviets themselves, with party dictatorship. But that's a bit more of a complex process, I think, than just simply calling it a coup. Many anarchists were involved in that struggle. They were involved in even acts like dissolving the Constituent Assembly, that kind of thing. So I would complicate that narrative a little bit. So yeah, that's all I have to say.
Yeah, thanks. I guess the reason I didn't talk about anarchism is because, I didn't want to set up a straw man and put words in anybody's mouth. So yeah, happy to talk about it now. Look, I guess there is often a lot of guess, confusion around organisation, and I suspect we probably do agree more on what an organisation looks like than disagree. Maybe we do disagree. I don't know. I suppose my view of what a revolutionary organisation is well, it groups together the most class conscious workers and active militants in any campaign. It comes from recognition that in the working class there's unevenness of consciousness. There are people who accept the dominant ideas. There are those who are absolutely fed up with the world we live in and want to create something different. And I suppose it's about bringing those people together and having some unity in action. I suppose democratic centralism is often a bit of a bogeyman. I mean, what my understanding of democratic centralism is just, firstly, the need for democratic discussion and debate, basically at all times, but also the need for unity in action for democracy to actually mean anything, for the democratic majority, for the majority to have any, for democracy to mean anything, the majority has to be able to enforce its decisions on the other members who, voluntarily are part of this democratic centralist organisation. So I suppose that's often something that comes up, in disagreements between anarchists and Marxists. I mean, with the Paris Commune, there was, when you say the police still existed, do you mean like the National Guard? And right. I mean, under any revolution, I'm not sure of the details, but under any revolutionary sort of situation, there is a need for security because there's counter-revolution and all kinds of sabotage that can happen in the context of, a revolution. So, an armed, I don't know.
Yeah, so anarchists would agree, and you can look to cases like, say, the Spanish Revolution, in which there were armed patrol committees and this kind of thing, served what you could call kind of police functions, but under popular control, responsible for mass organizations, that kind of thing. No, the Paris Commune had an actual police force, basically controlled by the blankest elements within what was effectively a representative democratic government. Marx was just simply had incorrect information. He was also making sort of a political intervention within the First International at a time when, politics were being really disputed between him and the faction that was going around Bakunin. Many Marxists have since, Karl Korsch, who's one famous Marxist, said that, look, what Marx says immediately after the Paris Commune is a total rejection of everything he's been saying. He's basically, Bakunin had justice on his side when he said, look, you're basically taking the best elements of what the kind of Proudhonian mutualists were claiming and the small group of collectivist anarchists within the commune. Their kind of highest aspirations were being claimed, despite them not really having any connection with Marxist politics before or after the commune. But yeah, it was mostly just based on bad information. People didn't really know what was going on. And they took the kind of highest aspirations of the commune by, again, those more libertarian elements and took them as the reality, but they don't reflect what actually happened.
Can I just make a point? Lachlan, your comment around democratic centralism, I would broadly agree. I don't have a fundamental problem with democratic centralism unless one treats democracy as a frozen antithesis. Okay? They're in relation to one another. And Dalton's comment around fire is really, really important to hold on to. With fire, democracy doesn't die, and centralism, where it gets out of control, will be tackled and burnt, if I can put it that way. But one of the things about the state or power is that if we are to really be serious about promoting revolution, about being revolutionary, we need to understand what we're talking about, and that is movements that aim for, work toward a qualitative leap in development. If we don't do that, And if we don't take responsibility for doing that ourselves, and I'm speaking brutally there, of course, then what we're doing is we are leaving that job to somebody else. And invariably, that tends to be social democracy, this, that, or the other. It doesn't matter what you call it. It's somebody else. And somebody else will tend to be, gee, guess what? Aren't we surprised? Supporting the capitalist system in some form or another. Okay? If we're going to take this issue of revolution seriously, we need to take the issue of power seriously, very seriously, including the possibility that we might fuck it up, that we may distort it. Coming back to Rock Dalton, the crib is one of fire. Okay? And I cannot stress the importance of that enough. And that of course, is what was missing, back in the mid-70s at the CPAML. There was no fire, there was only fucking ice.
Thanks. I'd like to return to what you asked, which is to address the concept of the state. I've never found a definition of the state in Marx's writings, which I think is one of the reasons why we can find representatives of Marxist groups today talking about smashing the state, which is very funny. Every time I've ever spoken to a Marxist and asked them what they think the state is, they always say the monopoly on the means of violence, which is characterisation. It's not a definition, but it's a characterisation of the state which is derived from the works of Max Weber. And I thought that in terms of the different attitudes to sociology that Marx and Weber practiced, that this might have been problematic. But so I think it's important here to offer a definition of the state so that we're all clear about it. The state is a hierarchical and bureaucratic apparatus of power that sits separate to and above the people it governs. So it's important to hold on to that definition because we need to relate it to a definition of democracy, which is when people come together on the basis of equality to deliberate on that which is common. If you reflect on these two definitions, you'll come to the same conclusion I have, which is that they are antithetical. Where democracy is, the state is not. The creation of democracy in its original direct participatory sense is the destruction of the state. Now, this has got all sorts of implications, one of them being the way we look back upon and analyse different societies in histories and draw lessons from them. If you want to go and study democracy, one of the key places to reflect upon is ancient Greece. Yet you always find it, at least in English language books, described as a place constituted by city-states. But in very fundamental ways, those that were characterised by democracy, Athens, Plataea, Chios and the others, to the extent that they were democratic, they weren't states. And the Greek word for this, the Greek word for those cities was polis, which is much closer to our word community. So I thought I'd just add that as a way of deepening the conversation on those points in relation to what you asked.
Could you take an interjection?
Just in a minute. In a minute, Arthur. We'll take a question. Arthur, we'll take a question from you in the Q&A, which will be about 15 minutes.
Yeah, please remind me to respond to that. I'm happy to respond
we'll
to
take the first question from you, Arthur, in Q&A. Tom, do you want to have some more comments? You have your official time for responses if you'd like to keep provoking. Tom.
No, I mean, I don't find that particularly overly interesting or relevant. I think what is often missing from conversations like this is an appreciation of culture. By culture, I mean the broad understandings, beliefs, and practices that dominate a society. And I think the reason I think this is relevant is that we will often talk about, with good reason, Russian Revolution, Chinese Revolution, etc. These were in those countries. The bourgeois revolution in many parts of these countries hadn't even bloody well begun. Okay, so both had been remarkably successful in completing the bourgeois revolution. They sure fell on promoting a proletarian revolution, and my hunch here is that for a proletarian revolution to actually be realistic to occur, to be successful, modernity, the bourgeois revolution, the bourgeoisification of the society needs to be utterly complete, which doesn't mean finished, because things tend to always develop, but the feudal ideas, traditional ideas, so they can be pre-feudal, they can be tribal, can dress themselves up or be interpreted as things that look remarkably necessary, almost modern, and almost revolutionary. No thanks. The confusion that has affected revolutionaries and revolutionary movements, and I'm speaking in particular of Russia and China, but it can go elsewhere, of course, has been profound. And it's a problem. I don't have an easy answer to it, but the problem is real. So that'll do.
Maybe, Johnny, maybe I'll just pull on that thread a little more, because Benjamin was talking about the distinctly modern character of the state, and certainly the bourgeois state and the capitalist state more recently. How do we, I think we were also talking a lot about the Paris Commune, and certainly we were talking sort of about the factual basis of the Paris Commune. I think the central question maybe of the prompt was, how does the Paris Commune tell us anything about the present? And certainly, as we have been noticing around the world, a resurgence in both Marxism and anarchism. There are certainly new anarchist organizations and new Marxist organizations appearing globally. And what is it about the present that invokes the memory of the Paris Commune? Why are anarchism and Marxism grasped for to help us understand the current form of the state? And what continuity is there between the state of 1871 or the state of 1848 and our present understanding of the state? Maybe we can, Matt, you can follow up on that.
I guess I would say that I think that history is relevant to the degree that, we're dealing with basically the same institutional structure, or you could talk about the state in terms of a state form. It's a certain form or model of social organisation. I would agree with what Benjamin said about just in his pure definition of what the state is, that it is this specific apparatus of government. And that's something which is very confused in Marxism. Marxism isn't clear about this at all. I don't think I would agree, as far as I understand, what he was talking about in terms of Greece. I don't think it's actually all particularly relevant. But so far as we're still dealing with the problem of the state as a model of social organisation, which emerged in tandem with class society, these are mutually reinforcing and reproducing sets of social relations. I think it's important to understand that it can't be a vehicle for overthrowing capitalism, and that as a necessary part of overthrowing capitalism is in doing away with the state, and that the state is either directly reproducing class relations through actual kind of control over production and the producers, or it's indirectly reproducing a distinct class, which it needs to exist for it to have any kind of power as a government. That's the only sense in which I would say it's relevant to today, is that we need to think about these things as institutional forms that are opposed to a project of human emancipation and constructing a social society, which is something which we as the working class have a direct role in producing by the fact that we're workers, and that we need to develop this kind of technical knowledge of production across supply chains. We need to understand how production works, and then we need to be able to take over it and repurpose the economic life of society to meet human needs. So that's the degree to which I find it relevant.
Would you like to comment?
Yeah, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, a Marxist definition of the state is, it's at its core, it's the armed forces, the military, the police, prisons, but beyond that, it's the whole unelected bureaucracy and courts, etc. Now, the state exists because there are class antagonisms in society, and states will exist until there is a classless society, I think. That's why I think in a revolution, that classes aren't abolished in revolution. In a revolution, it's about, if we're talking about workers' revolutions, it's about the working class, imposing its will on society, defeating counter-revolution, expropriating the capitalist class, essentially. Now, they are going to resist that, as they do in every revolution, and they have the capitalist state, they have their armies, which they regroup when they are temporarily pushed back. And I think the solution to that, there needs to be a centralized counterforce, which doesn't have to be, which isn't recreating a capitalist state. I suppose my understanding of the state is not an ahistorical one where all states are the same through different societies. Like, states are generated by specific social relations. The capitalist state is bound up with defending the needs of the capitalist class. When you have a working class seizing power, as you saw in Russia in October, the Bolsheviks took power, unopposed, essentially, because the entire working class essentially supported the Bolsheviks, and they were the only party willing to push the provisional government aside and bring in a government based on the workers' councils. Now, so a workers' state is one based on workers in power, workers running the factories, workers running the offices, workers being armed, and there not being a separate armed force that's against the working class. That's what makes a workers' state different, that it doesn't have an armed force that's against the workers. It's about the mass of the population being armed. As you saw in Spain and Russia, I mean, the problem with Spain was that the anarchist leadership refused to set up any alternative power and joined the bourgeois state.
Yeah, just quickly, I would say that the description of the worker state given there is entirely in line with the anarchist conception revolution. There is no distinction whatsoever. Anarchists don't oppose any of that. In regards to, with Russia, the problem was precisely that workers were disempowered at the point of production. There was a gradual dissolution of power within the organs of struggle that had developed, such as the factory committees and this kind of thing, and a centralization of economic decision-making in institutions like the trade unions, where the Bolsheviks had more sway as a party, and gradually into higher executive committees of power, which were above the workers. So that's the problem anarchists have there. In regards to Spain, complete agreement about what about half of the anarchist movement did in Spain, which was in the name of the Popular Front, the struggle against fascism. We put aside principles, we reconstitute the Republican government. There was a wing of the anarchist movement which sadly failed and had support actually from kind of dissident elements of the Marxist movement. The small but the ultra-left of the POUM essentially shared the anarchist position, the radical anti-collaborationist anarchist position, which was articulated by groups like the Friends of Derrida. It was endorsed by the Barcelona FAI. It was endorsed by the Libertarian Youth. And that's what the struggle in the May Days was about. It was an attempt to renew the revolution by smashing the state, which the CNT leadership were collaborating with and were integrating the movement in. And they failed. It's a complex story. A book I recommend is by Danny Evans called Revolution in the State, I think it's called. Goes through this whole story. And yeah, but I completely agree there needed to be a form of real, genuine workers' power based in the defence committees and the self-management of the factories and so on. It wasn't done. It was a violation of anarchist principles, and I think a real lesson in why the anarchist critique is correct. The anarchists didn't, as an entire movement, abide by their principles, and they failed precisely for that reason.
Just a point of clarification. I don't want to give the impression I'm against everything in Marxism. As a sociologist, I think he's quite interesting, and his analysis of capitalism in the commodity form are very, very much relevant and worth reading. I just want to talk a little bit more about the state as a concept again, and relate it to the concept of capitalism, and offer an explanation about why anarchists are against both capitalism and the state. The state is a hierarchical and bureaucratic apparatus of power, separate to and above the people it governs. And capitalist management is a hierarchical and bureaucratic apparatus of power that sits separate and above the workers it manages. What we have is a similarity between the two forms, an isomorphism, if you will, despite the differences in the two institutions. We're against both of them because they're undemocratic. I think this is an important point to make, because often in the discussions of the state, we are, to borrow another Marxist term, which I found in the work of George Lukács, I think we're in danger of reifying the state. One of the virtues of Marx's analysis of capitalism is that he reflects on it primarily as a social relation. I think thinking of the state as a social relation is also a valuable thing to do. And this is why, partly why I raised the Greeks before. The Greeks were very clear that the election of office bearers was for them an aristocratic principle, Aristos meaning best. The problem they had with it is that if you elect someone, they can stand for election again and again and again, and they can be elected again and again and again. And what you have is the emergence of a governing group who become a class with their own class interests. I think it's helpful to step back from the idea of class as if it's just workers and the bourgeoisie. So class relationships can emerge in the context of different institutions, and we ought to be wary of that.
Thanks. Tom, do you want to have some closing comments for this section before we start some Q&A?
For me, is this going or? Okay. One of the reasons I bang on about culture, how people actually think and behave, and how this is consistent with given economic and social relations. And the ones I have most familiar with, that I'm most familiar with in my work, are tribal, both of indigenous and refugee, particular refugee communities. Tribal cultural beliefs stick their hooks into the flesh and hang on, and they cannot be legislated away. So when we think about, when I think about what a revolution is, yes, one of its aspects is a political revolution. You know, the workers take power, for example. Then, well, that's when the work starts. That's when change can really has to be pushed through. When we think about the bourgeois revolution, that began, more or less, about the time of the Italian Renaissance. And it was only a few hundred years, millions of deaths, you know, like wars all over the joint, before it was able to stick its hand up and say, we're it, baby. Okay? This was the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment. Now, you can encourage cultural development. There is a need, post-formal revolution, for a cultural revolution. Mao understood that. Okay? One can argue about whether it was mistakes were made, all this sort of jazz. But the actual need of a cultural revolution is unambiguous. Okay? Where we are, to use an expression I heard in the 70s, we're pissing in the wind if we think otherwise.
Okay, well, that's a good point for us to now turn to the audience. And I think we have one willing question already. I'll walk around and hand the microphone, but if you want to think of a question to ask the panelist, please, go ahead.
First, an apology. I came late, missed the panel, and I'm interjecting. I can't possibly be asking a question. I'm on Tom's side. I'm also on the anarcho-communist side, and I didn't hear him speak, but it's absolutely clear which of the three I'm looking at that aren't Tom is the anarcho-communist, because there's something in common between anarcho-communists and the real world, and there's nothing in common between what I heard from the other two speakers and anything to do with anything that I would regard as left. Now, there's a debate going on, sponsored by Platypus at the moment, between Chris Patrone, who is their patron mentor sort of thing, and a guy called CryptoFash, who is trying to uncloak these sheep, to use these sheep disguised as wolves. And he's making a very clear point that what people here would regard as Marxism and the left are in fact precisely what Marx was writing polemics against in the 19th century. Right, that every idea that you will hear, both from the anarchists here talking about Marxism and from the Marxists that they've encountered, who have no resemblance to anything from the revolutionary movement, from anything remotely progressive. We have a bunch of people who are allied with the Labor Party in Australia, the Democratic Party in the US, who push all kinds of crap ideas and who any kind of progressive left movement would be ruthlessly criticising. Now, I quite enjoyed seeing the anarcho-communist posters around my area. I presume it's from the same group, because they've at least got that spirit of hostility and rebellion and so on. And it's nice to see them, you know, saying eat rich and so on, you know, very sharply directed against bosses and things. But what's actually needed for developing a revolutionary left movement is a ruthless criticism of the existing thing that pretends to be a left. And I disagree with CryptoFash about abandoning the left, and I agree more with Catrone, but as far as spirit's concerned, what is called the left these days is an enemy to be overthrown. Just as the Greek states that were held up to us as the examples of democracy, because instead of electing oligarchs, they had sortition at a random ballot to make sure that they didn't have a ruling class. They were the fucking ruling class. These were slave states. They existed to hold down the slaves by force, and the public assembly of all Greek citizens were the non-slaves, the slave owners, who were taking decisions about how to hold down the slaves. And to have that basic fundamental incomprehension and to be spouting about history of the Paris Commune and of the theories of Marxism and so on, is to me reflects a degree of disconnection from the real world that is tragic if it hadn't been going on for close to a century. Right? It's about half a century since the 60s movement that I took part in, right? And that was very minor. Marx was a 48er. I've been told to wind up, but I'm saying... Oh, sorry. Okay, also wind up. Okay, I'll do both then. You'll have to rip it out of my hand. There is another movement coming. I haven't seen this revival of Marxist groups or anarchist groups. I've seen the posters nearby, but whenever there's a revival, anarchism crops up again as a punishment for how horrible, like the First International degenerated into the Second International, and anarchism was an alternative to it. The Third International degenerated into fascism, and anarchism is an alternative to that too. But there is another movement stirring. At the moment, there was a recent pandemic over COVID, which is not over, and I would love to see a political left that was actually challenging the government's total failures to do anything about it. There's an economic crisis that they're saying is linked to COVID or to the Ukraine war, and it may or may not be, but we're headed into another economic crisis, and taking over the means of production will be pretty relevant. But the idea that a bunch of anarchists or the entire populace rising up and taking over the means of production could be a social revolution without having a state power that is capable of crushing the opposition. Because what you've just done is steal all the private property, right? And they have police forces and armies to stop people stealing their property. And they will not avoid that. And the reason you need a party is so that you can have ruthless criticism. It's not for any other function. It's for ruthless criticism.
Thank you. Benjamin, did you want to respond? I think there was an earlier question about the state that you asked, but you had something to respond. I'm not sure if it was in that comment.
If we want a revolution, and if I think we agree on the idea of revolution we want, it has to have a democratic form. It can't be just an establishment of economic equality. It needs to be practical political equality, and the only institutional form that can take is democracy. So in such a discussion, thinking about what the Athenian polis represented, what was good about it, and of course what was bad about it, I think is important, because it helps us to think about what direction we want to go and what are the reasons for that. As for the image of the Athenian polis that you've sketched, I don't think it's accurate. Yes, they had yes, they had slavery, and it wasn't a good thing. But that's not actually a criticism of the Greek concept of democracy. If you're going to analyse it properly, it's a criticism of the how expansive the Greek concept of the citizen was. Because a democratic relationship is a relationship between the people of the group. Now, I'm not at all advocating the Athenian society as an economic model at all. I'm just suggesting that being acquainted with the history and what they thought is helpful for us in our thinking as we strive towards a politics of revolution.
Yeah, thank you. I'm David Glantz. I'm from Solidarity, as is Lachlan. I've got two questions. One is to the whole panel. And that is, I'm assuming that you all agree that the struggle in the workplace, the struggle, the direct class struggle against exploitation, and it's the way in which it is managed inside the wage-labour relationship is fundamental. But what we haven't really heard yet from any of you, to be honest, is how the battle of ideas is fought out. Because the ruling class, yes, they have a bureaucracy, and yes, they have a monopoly on force, but actually most of the time they don't want to use that force. They want to win coercion through a process of, through an ideological process, which can be reflected through formal politics, but actually exists alongside as well as outside of formal politics. So one of the ways in which the Australian working class is tied to the ruling class and therefore to the project of the capitalist state is, for instance, Australian nationalism, which is extremely potent and at the moment is sort of focused in particular around a process of political panic around the potential of China to be not just an adversary but an enemy. Then there's all sorts of questions which crop up, transphobia, and quite clearly the right is trying to fight a war of ideas around transphobia, not because their target is the small number of trans men and women, but because their target is the mass of the working class who they're trying to frighten into submission behind the mainstream ideas. And then there's the question of Ukraine. So I suppose my question to all of you is, how do you see the battle of ideas being taken up, either as a Marxist or an anarchist? And I think concretely it would be interesting to know what your view is on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. My second question actually starts from the Paris Commune, because I think the Paris Commune was undoubtedly a qualitative leap forward in the class struggle. The first time that workers challenged state power and began to organise for themselves. But it was a very immature process. It was immature in lots of ways, that the working class was largely in small workplaces, workshops, that they never attempted to take over the central bank. They never attempted to march on Versailles and take on the army that was gathering to smash them. There was no strategy for spreading the revolt beyond Paris itself. And one particular way in which it was backward was actually women weren't allowed to vote for the Commune. Now, you fast forward even just to 1905 in Russia, and that backwardness is abolished. Working class women in the large factories are not going to take submission and servility as part of the package of revolt. So my question is actually to Platypus. 151 years after the Paris Commune, how on earth do we end up with a panel of 5 men at the front of the room?
Well, I'll field that as the representative of Platypus. We aim for our panels to be as ideologically and politically diverse as possible. We do invite women to our panels, and unfortunately they either refused or selected alternative members, but we are proud of the ideological diversity on our panels. Matt, would you like to respond to the political questions?
On the first one, in terms of ideological battles, I mean, I think that's where it's useful for those of us who have a shared analysis and, shared opposition to domination beyond just the workplace and, the command of the boss and all that kind of thing. I think it's useful for us to be spreading our ideas in an organised fashion, to be, I wouldn't, stand here and tell, there are trans movements out there, trans rights movements, trans struggles going on. I would more defer to them, listen to what they have to say, and then, as far as is possible, cooperate with those struggles and integrate them within the broader movement against all forms of repression. I don't think there's a really kind of easy answer to that, other than we fight the ideas, we condemn oppression and exploitation in whatever form it takes when we see it. We try and change people's minds. On that level of struggle, I mean, I don't think there's really a better answer to it than that. The Russia-Ukraine thing is very complicated, so I don't know if I can go into too much detail here, other than I absolutely take the position that it's a totally horrendous, imperialist act of aggression. The whole thing of how we should orient towards the kind of struggle against that oppression. I totally support the right of Ukrainian people to defend themselves from being attacked and killed. Long term, I think ideally you'd want to see as much democratic, for lack of a better word, control over that struggle by the people fighting it. And you would want to see it not be integrated into a authoritarian nationalist project, which there is a risk of doing in Ukraine itself. All I can really say here is that it's definitely a totally horrendous invasion, and that the Ukrainian people have the right to defend themselves. And I don't think saying that they have the right to defend themselves means that we do or should embrace a kind of pro-NATO position. Why not? Because NATO is an imperialist alliance of imperialist states. In terms of, should Ukrainians be able to get weapons from where they can to defend themselves? Okay, I'm not going to say I oppose them getting weapons from somewhere if they happen to. What I'm saying is that we shouldn't find ourselves echoing the kind of neo-Stalinist approach of saying, well, we're on the side of Russia because it's anti-West. We shouldn't say that, okay, well, we're on the side of NATO and we want NATO to keep on expanding and for it to continue militarizing previously neutral states. I think that's bad news for everybody, and that it's not consistent with an anti-militarist politics.
Anyone else like to respond
To that question?
Sure. Firstly, on the Ukrainian question, I'd agree with Arthur. Why not? Putin is the closest thing to a 21st century fascist of the Nazi type that I've seen. And the Russian state itself is becoming increasingly, or if it hasn't already got there, fascistic. Now, I've been staggered, and I really mean staggered, by the amount of old lefties, including some who were in the CPIML with me, although they didn't expel themselves, who at the time would have said, Russia, social imperialist. Okay? Now, in the late 90s, Russia didn't become social imperialist, it became overtly and proudly capitalist, and imperialist in that sense. And yet these same people are now saying, oh, but it's all NATO's fault. This is all a US imperialism plot. For Christ's fucking sake. The Ukrainian people have every right to defend themselves, should be supported, and I hope that in defending their patch of turf, they create or exacerbate divisions inside Russian society which enable the regime there to collapse. But whether that happens, I don't know. I really hope. As for the ideological question, it's a really interesting and important question. And without wishing to sound flippant, I come back to Dalton's comment around the crib of fire. Without a crib of fire, with us stoking the flames as necessary, okay, we are much more likely to fall victim to dominant bourgeois ideology in some form or another. Cryptofascists' comment around, left-right being wings of bourgeois ideology, I think has real credibility. That doesn't mean that there's not been a left which is separate from that, which I tried to focus on in my opening remarks. But more than that, let me leave it there. Others may want to speak.
I'll just maybe we'll return to those questions. Hang on. Did you have one? No, yeah. Just quickly. Yep.
I agree more with Matt. What Russia's doing is clearly barbaric, and Ukrainians obviously have the right to defend themselves, but it's being turned into a proxy war where NATO is essentially, using Ukraine as a battering ram to punish and defeat Russia. We can't side with our own ruling classes. the Australian government is clearly on the side of NATO and is part of the fight with Russia, and the crippling sanctions, which are making life hell for Russian workers and the people who should be our allies, really, in bringing down their own government. We should be making common cause with the anti-war struggles in all the countries, rather than expecting our own militaries to somehow be part of the solution. That's the recipe for World War III, nuclear war. Like, it's very scary. And I mean the context here as well is clearly the US, but the Australian government in particular, our government's hostility to China and an arms race with China. The nuclear subs, hundreds of billions of dollars spent on arming up against China. I think we need to be firmly against our own government's militarisation. If anyone is free next Saturday at 12:30, there's an anti-AUKUS demo at 12:30 at the State Library. I think that's very important. On the changing of ideas, as a socialist activist, I think what's really important is that ideas don't usually change a huge amount just left in the abstract. Like, ideas change in struggle. That's why the self-activity of workers is just so crucial. It's why, Marx said, the philosophers have interpreted the world, the point is to change it. Like, ideas change the most in revolution, but they change in any form of struggle when workers, start to challenge the submissiveness they've been brought up with, start to see their co-workers as allies, whether they be trans or black or white or female or male. That's when a lot of these divisions can really break down, and some of the really backward and mainstream ideas can be broken down. And it's really the role, I think, of socialists. I think it's particularly the role of a revolutionary organisation to have a consistent sort of approach to these questions of changing ideas, but really leading people in struggle to challenge these ideas and fan the flames of struggle wherever they are. So, like, in New South Wales, it's doing our best to support and take part in, if we can, with the nurses and teachers strikes. There's going to be an early childhood strike in September here. Like, any of those ways that we can break against that insubordination, that subordination that is pushed on workers. Like, when workers start fighting back, those are the times when we really need to pounce on them and try to spread them as much as possible, because that's when ruling ideas start to can break down.
Thank you. I've got two questions from Zoom, and then I'll go to the back of the room. Maybe this one to you, Benjamin, to start with. This is from Ephraim in London, UK, who asks, the millennial left has thought of its own trajectory as being, quote, from protest to politics, end quote, to use a phrase of Leo Panich's. That is, Corbyn and Sanders style social democracy and working in Labor or DSA as a successful overcoming of the limitations of the protest politics of the anti-globalization movement and Occupy, which were associated with anarchism, sort of loosely associated with anarchism. They celebrated an apparent overcoming of anarchism, yet neo-social democracy has also been a failure on its own terms. What do the anarchists say in response?
The anarchist strategy, which I participate in, is the anarcho-syndicalist strategy. We're not just about protest. We're about the building of institutions that can contest power in the workplace, and through that contestation build our organisations in the hope that we could one day contest power in society and create revolution. This mode of politics is important in that it's a model of collective self-management of the struggle that we're engaged in which we invite other people to participate with us. It's also important in that it models and builds a culture. This is an important part of the anarchist strategy, because the structures of our organisations themselves are just one piece of the puzzle. But perhaps more important is the culture that develops within those institutions, especially if you've got a revolutionary project, because the culture of the organisation and its project needs to be able to withstand the stresses of a revolutionary situation in which there are temptations to engage in authoritarian politics. We can't create a libertarian socialist society through authoritarian means, which means we need to model, practice that culture amongst ourselves. This is really the only viable strategy for revolution, at least as I see it.
Thank you. Brandon, do you want to have a quick comment as well?
Yeah, I would just say that if I would agree that sort of this neo-social democratic moment that we had from roughly 2015 to 2020 or so, in many ways that was kind of a punishment for the limitations of the strategies of things like Occupy, the movements of the squares, and this kind of politics, which is, though it often associated with anarchism, is a very specific kind of anarchism, which you could kind of loosely call small A anarchism or neo-anarchism. If anyone's interested, I have a series of articles coming out on Red Black Notes critiquing this from the mass class struggle and anarchist perspective. It's an understandable switch that a lot of people who are on the left activists made, in that they saw that, okay, like hanging out in the park and kind of practicing, good practice of, okay, we're directly democratic, we're using consensus and all these kind of things, seeing that, okay, this wasn't really able to, not let alone create a social revolution, didn't have too much impact in terms of pushing reform. I mean, it maybe politicized a lot of people, it had kind of useful and positive effects, but it had harsh limitations. And so people moved from protest to politics. And what I think we're hopefully seeing now, at least a little bit of, is that with disillusionment in politics, people are now moving to the idea of, okay, well, what about class struggle? Because class struggle was just off the table. A real militant class struggle, one which doesn't defer to kind of these arrangements we have in Australia. You can think post-accord, if we have this idea of arbitration, we play by the rules that the capitalist state sets up for us. But this idea of as soon as we started seeing things like in America with the teachers' wildcat strikes, and this idea that there's another alternative to both protest and politics, and that is organising on the job, exercising power where we have it, which is as workers within capitalist production. And that's a tool for us to exert leverage both over our bosses in terms of improving the conditions of work, getting better wages, shorter work hours, that kind of thing, but also building the capacity for where one day we can hopefully take over the means of production and repurpose production to meet human needs. So hopefully we're starting to see a revival in the interests of politics being something that can be exercised at work rather than it being some alien kind of process where you find a good candidate who says some nice things and you try and get him to win, and then you hope he does the right thing under hostile conditions. Hopefully that's what we're starting to see, and I would see that as a return to the kind of politics that my kind of anarchism advocates.
I think it's important to make the observation that protest politics is often a politics of supplication. It's a politics of relating to people in the hope that they will fulfill your demands, which they're in power to make. It seems to replicate a relationship of a service provider and client, as if the politicians that can make these decisions are the service providers and we are the clients. We could also extend that critique to the mainstream union movement, which in many respects markets itself as a service provider to the workers who are nominally their members, but which they relate to as clients. And part of the problem, part of the reason this has come about is because they've become professionalised. I think a much better model of unionism is one in which it's volunteer-based and we relate to each other as equals and we provide each other with that mutual aid. It also creates a relationship within the union groups of collective self-management and autonomy. And really, if that's the sort of society that we want to create, we need to create it through those sorts of institutions and build them up.
Thank you. I've got another question online, then I'll go to Lee and then maybe a quick comment from Arthur at the end. And then if there's any more questions, put your hand up. And oh yeah, we've got questions here, so I'll get more. So Andy Blunden online asks, I'd be interested in what the speakers make of the fact that no anarchist or Marxist has gathered sufficient popular support to win a seat at a state or federal level for about a century. Given this fact, do they see themselves capable of leading a social revolution? What changes in their own politics or in the social situation do they anticipate to justify their confidence, if they do indeed have such confidence? Maybe Lachlan, do you want to start with this and then Tom? No, either or.
Well, I mean, Marxists and my version of Marxism doesn't really see power and activism really coming through parliament or elections. I mean, it would be great to have some socialists in parliament to, take the fight to whoever, all the right wingers in parliament, but it's only as an adjunct to, the real. Where our real power is, which is on the streets and in the workplaces. Parliament, like I said, it's part of the state really, and it's not something that we can use to improve our own situation. Although any reforms we can win through Parliament, obviously, are good, and we want to push for them. Why we haven't had any? There's lots of reasons. The dominance of capitalist ideas mean that socialist views are often in a minority. You've had periods where, in the post-war period, obviously there were a lot of social democrats in power, and a lot of them claimed to be Marxists, and mass communist parties as well, claiming to be Marxist. Now, I suppose I should have said it before, the genuine socialist tradition in Marxism, in my opinion, is socialism from below, not what you saw in the post-war, or basically after Stalin, where the communist parties essentially became, were focused on parliament in a lot of ways. They had a lot of strength in trade unions and could, mobilise workers that way, but they were no longer revolutionary parties. They basically wanted to, take power through the state and through parliament, which isn't what, that I've got nothing in common with that sort of approach. It was, the degeneration of the Russian Revolution and the Communist Party into a dictatorship that led to, the Communist parties basically giving up on revolution, on international revolution as an aim. Anyway, I've kind of
gone off topic. But
Thanks. Tom, did you want to comment?
Am I on? Yeah. That's all right. I mean, look, what can you say? I mean, we haven't had representation in Parliament, etc., or equivalents, for a century because we haven't bloody well deserved it. It says something about, simultaneously, about our failings, combined with the strength of capitalism in the advanced world. And we've also been very ambivalent as movements about Parliament, about parliamentary democracy and so on. Added to that, words like Marxism and anarchism are Humpty Dumpty words. They mean what you want it to mean. I mean, it's so vague. I understand where the question is coming from, but to nail down what in fact we're talking about when we talk about Marxism or anarchism, tricky. I couldn't, hard to say. So, yeah, anyway, that'll do.
Regarding the vague. Sorry. Regarding vague, I would have thought fire in the crib was vague. Look, the type of change that we want to see in society is not something that's going to come along through parliaments. As soon as you elect representatives to parliaments, those representatives become a class unto themselves with an interest in getting re-elected, which becomes a preoccupation for them over and above pushing the sorts of change their constituents want. Coupled to this, the logic of representationalism, whereby in order to promote one's chances of getting elected, one can sell out of one's constituency in order to make a play for the votes of the constituency of your rivals. The people who are elected betray the people who elect them time and time again. It's not going to build socialism, it's not going to build the sort of revolutionary change we want, which is why we've got a different approach.
I don't have some. My name's Lee Kendall. I'm a member of the Melbourne North affiliate of the Anarcho-syndicalism Federation. I don't have a question so much as just a few comments I wish to make about some of the topics that have been mentioned. Firstly, the Paris Commune and Marx's civil war in France. I don't agree with Matt's generous interpretation. I believe Marx was an authoritarian, and he came on like a libertarian in the civil war in France because he wanted to appear that way, because he could see quite clearly the influence of the Kuhnist or federalist or collectivist, whatever it was called in those days, because it wasn't called anarchism in those days. Those were the sorts of politics that were being exemplified in the Paris Commune, and he wanted to get on board with it. Any doubt about what Marx believed in that regard, I think, was extinguished by his behaviour subsequent to the Paris Commune, where he contrived to destroy the First International rather than see it fall under the influence of what later became known as anarchism. Secondly, I'm sorry, I forgot your name. Is it Lachlan? Lachlan, you admitted a lot about what happened in the Russian Revolution, and your characterisation of it, I think, is contradicted, most in the first case by a participant, G.P. Maximoff, who wrote The Guillotine at Work. It's a book worth reading. And even if you don't want to read something critique of the Russian Revolution by an anarchist, you could read Maurice Britton's The Bolsheviks and Workers' Control, which pretty much clearly demonstrates what I think Ben was saying, that it was a coup, and they didn't have the popular support that was claimed, and that they worked actively against the Soviets. And by the way, all power to the Soviets was an anarchist slogan that was appropriated by Bolsheviks. Thirdly, with regard to what Matt's characterisation of the Spanish Revolution, and it's a problem, you mentioned Danny Evans, it's a problem with all English-speaking texts about the Spanish Revolution, and I'm not sure if you're able to read Spanish, but there's so much more in Spanish that needs to be read about that. But I think it's a little bit unfair, and I noticed that Lachlan also did the time-honoured mentioning of the CNT, the 4 members of the CNT, who were both members of the CNT and the FAI, although at the time 2 were representing the CNT and 2 were representing the FAI, and that they agreed to join the Catalonian government because of the political pressure to maintain the Popular Front, but also because they were severely lacking in arms, and it was thought that the way to obtain arms was to perhaps join the government. And clearly it was a mistake. And I think it's a little bit dishonest to take one incident in the history of anarchism and dismiss the entire history of anarchism on the basis of what 4 people did, because it certainly wasn't the position of the vast majority of the CNT. And fourthly, with regard to culture that, Tom mentioned, and I would recommend a reading of Rudolf Rocker's Nationalism and Culture, particularly the introduction, where he demolishes the materialist conception of history. And that's the point of partly what Tom was speaking about, the point of that book, Nationalism and Culture. And with regard, because I believe Tom was correct with regard to culture, and if we want to we need to create a working class culture. And the problem with the left, which is why I do not identify myself as left, is the left, and the reason why there's a lot of workers who hate the left is not because they're right wing, it's because the left represent their bosses. They look, act and sound like their bosses, to which the right has taken great advantage of, and you can see this reflected in electoral results. I was involved in a publication which had a focus on a particular industry. This publication we saw as a vehicle to promote anarchist politics. And as a result of that experience, I realised that the ideas that we were talking about are much more popular and easily relatable to than people realise, and that the apparent passivity of the working class is more of a perception than it is real. And there are clearly some things about anarchism which were enormously popular amongst the workers I worked with, but there were also things that weren't. The one thing I did discover that wasn't particularly popular or didn't get a lot of traction was the anti-police position that was taken sometimes, because a lot of people thought, oh, the police do a good job and, you know, it's a hard job, blah, blah, blah. But culture is important. And in this regard, I think this is my observation, going back to the 1970s, that the entire left press completely missed this. And when they stand outside the factory gates saying, buy a copy of Socialist, whatever it is, they shouldn't be surprised when workers say, no thanks, I'm a socialist, because they just can't relate to that kind of stuff. And you really do need to think about how those ideas are presented. And I think perhaps, I'm not very good at these sorts of things, but I think the new technologies provide an opportunity for younger people to really do something about that, and to speak to people in terms that they can relate, and to talk about issues that actually really mean something to them. Things like, I know from my own experience, childcare is a really big issue in the workplace, aside from things like wages and conditions and that sort of thing. Those are just the comments I'd like to make.
Matt, then Lachlan for a quick response. Hold on.
Thanks.
So just to respond to a couple of things that were addressed to me, I don't think we do disagree. That was basically my presentation of what Marx's reaction to the Paris Commune was. I think he, one, had some bad information, and two, he was making a political intervention in opposition to the kind of developing anarchist current. And I think that was destructive to the First International. I don't think we actually disagree on that. Not really interested in rehashing the stuff on Russia, to be honest. But in regards to Spain and what I said about Spain, I think you slightly soft-pedaled the level of integration within the state that did occur. There was down through regional levels of the CNT, there was integration with kind of redeveloping municipal councils and this kind of thing, taking on governmental functions. This was a real problem, and I think you could say it was roughly about half of the organisation that was at least tacitly supportive of this project. Then opposition really started to develop, and I think it became the majority current to be anti-collaborationist, particularly around the May Days. And sorry, I've forgotten what I was just about to say about Spain. In regards to the texts that are available, I recommended Danny Evans because it's a very readable book in English. But for a text that was originally in Spanish, someone who knows a lot about it, you can read Insurrection by Augustin Guillamon. Danny Evans is building up a lot of his work. He knows a lot about it. It's a Spanish text, so you can read it there. I think it shows what I said to be true, that there was real compromises made in reconstituting the Republican government, and that the forces there that were really revolutionary and showing the anarchist conception of what a social revolution looks like were the Friends of Durruti, were the Barcelona FAI, the Libertarian Youth, and really whole swathes of the CNT, which rejected the collaborationist policy and wanted to end it.
Do you have anything you want to say? Well, maybe then you'll. We have a quick follow-up question from Andy Blunden, who says, "Yeah, oh please, Tom. Sorry.
Is this? It's on. Look, firstly, don't let me leave the room without you telling me about that book you mentioned earlier, and I won't let you leave the room without talking to you about Norbert Elias's The Society and the Individual, because one of the things I took from what you were saying is the importance of individuality. The importance, I mean, you can call it individualism if you like. I'm not talking about bourgeois individualism, but the individual being able to stand up and grow. And any left-wing or revolutionary movement which doesn't embrace that is fraudulent. And people just won't put up with it. So there are lessons for us there. And this is a lesson that's been driven home to me by the years I've worked as a therapist and a group therapist, because when you work there, you're working with individuals and groups. You're not working with a blob, okay? And so that's something that I've learned, and which just happens to be consistent with the political stuff. Now, the other thing about the comment you made about what is it that people really find important, when you talk about workers coming out of factories and so on. I'm reminded of a comment or a couplet that Brecht put in The Life of Galileo. It was in scene 5 or 6 or whatever it was. But he introduced this scene with, "Things indeed take a wondrous turn when learned men do stoop to learn." And if we are to be serious about being revolutionaries, yes, of course, we have we embrace a revolutionary ideology, but to develop a mass base, we need to take a stooping stance. We need to find out what actually matters to people.
Thanks, Tom. Maybe that ties in from this follow-up question from Andy Blunden, who says, "So you think making a revolution is easier than winning a seat in Parliament?" Anyone like to respond to that?
As an abstraction, sure. And don't we get lost in abstractions?
All right. Let's take Alan.
Thank you. In Tom's opening remarks, you had the 4 examples of rebelliousness and communism, and each of these 4 examples, the good communists were outnumbered by the bad communists. So my question for you and for anyone who wants to answer is, why do far left organisations have these elements that want to put out that fire? Like, is it something about the organisation? Is it something about what the people we attract? What's happening? There's so many conservative elements within far left groups.
Is it on?
Yeah.
It is. Okay. Look, very, very good question. It's not good, bad. Okay, to some degree that's a false antithesis. We live. Everyone lives in a cultural environment, and most of the time we're not even aware as to what the values are that culture is telling us. It's like Phil's comment, my old comrade's comment. Follow me and you never think again. This is what I see often in the work I do with refugees. To give you an example, 2 examples. A Sierra Leonean man, a colleague, said to me 10 years ago or so, "We have come from hell to find heaven, and it is heaven if you change overnight." Well, that shouldn't be too hard then. And a South Sudanese woman who'd been here for quite some time, in explaining the difference between there and here, marriage in Sudan like a prison. Here, for 2 years, we go mad. And she meant by that, it took her about 2 years for the pennies to drop. But with freedom comes responsibility. Now, they're not pennies that have to drop for us because we've grown up in an environment where this is just part of the deal. Now, so being able to identify with and stay with revolutionary ideas, policies, stuff is easier said than done, because, as Marx pointed out in the manifesto, all that's solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. And to keep up with that, not easy. So I don't have a problem with people fucking up. Done it myself often enough. Okay? But this is where the fire is important. Okay? It's the crib that we need to nurture.
All right. Thank you.
Benjamin, I've just had a question for you. So it's just a kind of a semantic thing. So when you, just with your definitions of the state, and what is the state, what isn't the state, and saying the state will never work, have you ever considered new political strategies? For example, there's an Australian party called Flux. They want to elect a senator who will vote in Parliament only according to what everyone votes on an app. In other words, it's kind of like this, it confuses things a little bit. Of course, you assume that they do what they promise. They're essentially advocating a recallable delegate, optional direct democracy system within the state.
Firstly, it's not that the state doesn't work, it just doesn't work in a way that's healthy for us. I'm resistant to the idea of these sorts of technology-mediated representatives as a quasi kind of delegate. They don't provide the thing that they don't provide a social context, which is very important, which is the debating and arguments within your group. One of the reasons why anarcho-syndicalism is attractive to me is that it's a collectivism. We have a federation of groups, and those groups support each other through mutual aid, and through the federation we organise how we're going to communicate and relate to each other to make sure that the communications are genuine communications and authorised by the groups, not by individuals who might want to speak on behalf of the groups without having a mandate from the group. But the democratic process within our federations happens within the local groups. All of the initiatives for actions that occur within the whole federation, whether it be ASF or the broader IWA, they come up from those groups. And it's the democratic life of those groups which is important and vital, and which is a direct source of peer support for the workers who make up those groups. When we don't expect everyone will be anarchists to join us. We're actually open to all workers. The anarchist character of the organisation is the structure and the culture of the organisation as such. So we're not interested in just being this tiny little ghetto for anarchists. we want to build a mass organisation which is capable of undertaking a direct contest of power with the state. We're a long way from that goal at the moment, but that is the plan we hope to realise.
Yeah, I would just say that though formally that seems like a kind of, oh, well, this is, direct democracy, we're having control over a decision that's being made by someone who is nominally above us. One is you kind of raising their own questions, well, there's no actual control that can then be exercised over the decision they make. There's someone who has a kind of constitutional, they have a role within the existing system and they can do what they want with those rights that are given to them. And then the reality is that what we're saying they can vote on with this app or whatever is that, okay, they vote yes or no on a particular bill within a capitalist state. And that this is, the votes being the right or the wrong way aren't the problem with what's going on in the state. The state as an institution in itself and the kind of structural veto power, the real power being invested in, the people who own the means of production, the economic life of the society. None of that changes because we tell, and hopefully they follow through, some politician to vote yes or no on some piece of legislation that takes place within an institution that isn't going to accept expropriation. That is, and this isn't a process that's empowering workers on, in their workplaces. Just in regards to touching on some of the comments that were made on anarcho-syndicalism, one critique that I would make of what was kind of just talked about as a strategy is that I think that there is a risk in trying to build such a mass organisation and attaching the name of anarchist to it and then saying you don't have to be an anarchist or hold anarchist ideas to be involved in it. There's kind of a risk there in the fact that you're merging a specifically anarchist, the idea of having an anarchist organisation with the work of just working with whoever's your co-worker. You're uniting with them on a class basis to, engage in whatever struggle, maybe trying to get a wage increase or whatever. And I think it just kind of confuses things a little bit. You're either, as was said, ghettoizing yourself and saying, okay, you join if you're an anarchist, or you're saying, well, the anarchism of the union is kind of nominal. Trying to build workplace structures of workplace struggle that fashion in an anarchist fashion, I totally agree with that part of it. So my critique here isn't to say like I'm totally hostile to anarcho-syndicalism, but it's that there is a risk, I think, in saying, okay, this is the anarchist organisation, and I think that even you would have trouble getting a lot of people to join, even if you said, oh, it's open to non-anarchists, and you've got all kind of these proclamations of we're a libertarian, socialist, revolutionary organisation. I think it's a little bit of a risky and confused approach, and I would more advocate what was typically known as dual organisationalism, which is that we have our specific anarchist organisations and we intervene where possible, wherever we can create forms or engage with forms that allow for that kind of rank and file control over struggle is what we should encourage. And that could take all kinds of forms. And Anarcho-syndicalist union is one of them.
Thank you. And then we'll have two more questions and then we're done.
It's possible that we change the name, but we want the character of the organisation to be an anarchist organisation. But we do intend to become a genuinely mass organisation. And the larger any organisation grows, the more difficult it is to maintain a high degree of ideological cohesion amongst all the members. One of the benefits of anarcho-syndicalism as a model is that doctrinally it's minimalist. It's we don't seek to strive for tremendous ideological cohesion. What's important is that we work. What's important is that a culture of struggle and mutual aid develops inside the organisation. But it's important that people can come with different ideas, because the best ideas rise to the top through debate. And this goes back to a very important thing. We're collectivists, but we need people who have got a strong sense of individuality, because they need to be able to come along to meetings and to think and speak for themselves and articulate their desires and how they can be supported. We encourage people who want to join because they've got issues to, in a very strong way, take ownership and management of the problem in the workplace, rather than just come to us as people that can help and possibly direct them. We've got no interest in directing them. We've got an interest in partnering with them so that they can free themselves. Because if you can't free yourself, you can't free anyone else. And that's why the ethos of egalitarianism and the idea that the membership don't act as clients to people, don't act as consultants to people coming to us. We don't want that consultant-client relationship. We want to build something different.
Okay, thank you. Just two more quick questions.
Well, hello. From my experience in the Melbourne left, probably the majority of self-identified anarchists that I've met have politics that basically amount to moral individualism, lifestyle choices, this sort of thing. And, probably my experience is not representative of Australian anarchism, but I'm wondering what the panel thinks about why it is that, quite a lot of people who label themselves as anarchists hold a politics that is just basically lifestyle choice. How you explain that phenomenon? Is it just a kind of liberalism that shrouds itself in anarchist rhetoric, or is it a kind of symptom of the regression of modern politics in the left today, or does it just have nothing to do with any of the traditions represented on the panel today?
Thanks.
Yeah, I would just say that unfortunately, I think your experience has been pretty representative for a long time. That is what when you encounter someone who labels himself an anarchist, that is what you'll find. I think that has, and there are similar currents kind of within Marxism that, autonomous types of Marxism have kind of overlapped with some of this. And I think a lot of it just has to do with the fact of, the workers' movement, the international workers' movement underwent a real historic defeat kind of beginning in the late 70s, and it was disorganized, and the militancy was totally evacuated out of it. And then there came all these kind of ideas of, okay, the worker is no longer a revolutionary subject, we've got to find liberation, all these kind of other ways. And really, as far as I'm concerned, it was basically giving up, and it was kind of giving an ideological justification for not doing the hard, often thankless work, which will often be at a very small scale. I mentioned in my opening remarks the collective Angry Workers of the World. I strongly encourage everyone to read their book, Class Power in 0 Hours. I mean, a lot of the times they're talking about kind of really small steps of beginning to communicate with their co-workers, find out what the grievances are. And to some people who look at things like, we nearly got in America, Bernie Sanders elected or something. This stuff seems like, small potatoes to people like that. And it's kind of understandable because there's this illusory proximity to power. And, this just seems like such a gigantic hill to climb of how do we get to, social revolution from there? And I just think there's no, getting out of it. That's just the work that needs to be done. And as far as we're starting to see a reorientation within movements like anarchism, within Marxism, towards a politics of developing our capacity for class struggle, I think that's a positive development, and I hope it keeps going.
We've got perhaps us, the Anarchists into this federation, have got a reasonably narrow idea of what an anarchist is. I mean, when I say narrow, I mean precise. And the types of individual you've described, individualist, attracted to lifestyle, I think they're attracted to the image. They like the anti-authoritarianism, they like the image of defiance. Often they associate it with cultural movements such as punk. And while we welcome their interest, we don't think of them as anarchist, because anyone can appropriate a label. And much of what goes on in our society is people are appropriating styles. It's what's marketed to them. It's a lot of how the consumer economy works. And in a way, it's natural, especially for young people who are trying to carve out self-identity for themselves. It's natural for people to adopt or try on for size different images and different personas. It doesn't always run very deep, and that's a shame. If there's anyone to whom we're broadcasting who's who feels that this describes them, don't take our bridge. Come and get in contact with us and start a conversation with us, because we really like to talk about anarchism. We can bore the legs off a chair if given half the chance.
We'll just have another quick question here before we'll wrap up.
Hi. Just a quick question related to Tom. You talk about culture and kind of like the ideological totality of society, if you like. And then Lachlan, you started off by saying, giving an acknowledgement of country, and Tom, you had a thing to add on there, and you said, but also, Tom, you have this whole thing about bourgeoisification. Societies kind of need to go through a bourgeois element, and Lachlan, Aboriginal societies, as far as I understand, had a very complex, had all kinds of strength, like totemic religion was a kind of their religious cosmology, if you like. There was all kinds of hierarchical structures in that society. And I just wonder, to what extent do you see like post-capitalism or anarchism as being a return to some kind of new and better like totemic religion, or is it more that, anyway, that's a big topic, but
Tom or Lachlan, do you want to respond?
There's obviously bits there for Lachlan to pick up on. I think you're right about traditional Aboriginal society, and by which I don't mean that the hierarchical structure is the equivalent of hierarchical structures in class societies, but up in Alice, when I say we, I mean not just white fellow workers, but white fellow black workers, joke about SWB and SMB, secret women's business and secret men's business, and the hierarchy of traditional the traditional leaders, the religious leaders, if you like. It's real, simultaneously real and broken. The broken picture ain't pretty, and there will still be time that needs to pass before something can be built in its place. That's an aside. Post-revolutionary society, would you like to be a fly on the wall 200, 300, 400 years' time? Yes, sure. I'd love Doctor Who to drop in. That'd solve a lot of problems. But no, we can't predict these things easily. They'll be very different. But how can we predict what the principal contradictions will become post-revolution? And once they have been sorted, what will emerge after that? To be quite frank, It's not our problem, and we're in no position to make those comments, other than the fact that in the abstract you're still happy with it. We've got to worry about what's happening now.
Lachlan, did you want to add to that?
I suppose obviously Indigenous societies are very spiritual. I suppose there's hierarchy in all kinds of societies, but there isn't arbitrary authority. Like, I suppose, the authority of elders in Indigenous societies comes from experience and primarily experience and just respect within communities. And I suppose if you expand that to other pre-class societies, there wasn't class distinctions, and I suppose that's a history all of humanity shares. Like, class society is a very recent thing, and that's sort of the point I kind of was making after the acknowledgement, is that that's our history. If we have a human nature, which I don't really think we do, but if we have any inbuilt sort of tendency, it is towards egalitarianism, and because that's the vast majority of our history as a species. In terms of what the future socialist society would have, I don't have any blueprints. I don't think we can really say. I don't think it will be. I think it will have a much more secular sort of spirituality, and maybe it will look a bit more like pre-class societies in terms of just a special connection, or restoring the connection that we should have with the natural world, which is broken by capitalism. But in terms of religion as this thing that we project a lot of human characteristics onto an all-powerful God, I think that's a characteristic of class societies and the kind of alienation of people under, class society. So I don't think that would really exist in a future classless society, but who knows?
There's one final...
Can I just make a point on that one? I'll only take less than a minute. Human beings are spiritual creatures, okay? There's no doubt about that. But we make the gods, we make the saints, we make spirituality. And it's not simply class related. Most of human existence, 150,000 years, whatever, has been without classes. It's prehistory. And it was about survival. So the projections that occurred, and you're right, there are certainly projections involved, dealt with nature, and our relationship to nature and our struggle to survive. It's about survival, okay?
All right. Lastly, from Arthur, with hopefully a question.
No. I think Andy Button put his finger on it. It's obviously going to be much harder to make a revolution than to elect people to Parliament. The only recent parliamentary struggle I'm aware of that came anywhere near an electoral quota in one seat was that nationally people put both major parties last. About 50,000 more people did than normal because they jailed me for urging them to. And I think that's the largest electoral campaign that there's been in the last couple of decades. But if you can persuade them to jail you for telling people to put them last, then you'll get a lot of people putting them last. And when I say a lot, 50,000 out of a much, much larger electorate. But I think that's more than any of the candidates of the various tribal groups that we're encountering here are able to get in elections. But I want to say one thing. Anybody that can't say very clearly that we're at war with the fascist Tsar of Russia, who is invading Europe, Western Europe at the moment, is not capable of organising a tea party, let alone a revolution. The popular opinion in Australia that is extremely backward is well ahead of what I heard explicitly from three of the speakers here, which was the NATO line, that the Ukrainians are entitled to defend themselves, whereas the Ukrainians are saying, we are under attack from fascists. There is a war against fascism. It is a global war. You're welcome to volunteer. There's a foreign legion. We need arms. We need mass support. They're getting crowds of hundreds of thousands speaking to their, listening to the Ukrainian speaker, speaking to them in the streets of Prague and Munich and other European cities. They are mobilising a mass movement worldwide against fascism. And what you call the left in Australia has nothing to do with it. And if you wanted to have an example of ruthless critique of the kind of fight you're in for when there is a left, try actually discussing what you're going to do about the fact that fascism being at war right now in your little tiny sets, right? The response you'll get will be people mumbling about a NATO proxy war and how we mustn't get, Russia getting isolated with sanctions. And that is as close as you've got to popular opinion. You're halfway between NATO and Putin, right? NATO is not doing what it ought to be doing, which is sending troops to fight fascism. Putin is saying, oh, we can't have sanctions because we're allowed to invade Ukraine, and you're echoing him. How could anything as pathetic, as backward, and as explicitly reactionary as that ever attract any mass support from anybody with blood running in their veins?
Would anyone like to respond to that?
Couldn't agree more.
Well,
it's too complicated to go into this topic at this point, but I would just say that I disagree, and that I don't think this kind of standpoint epistemology of, well, though I sympathise totally with people that are desperate and want help. There were many Ukrainians, including the government, also calling for, a no-fly zone, which would just be totally disastrous. So, that shouldn't be the metric by which we make decisions of ex-oppressed group or, group under attack says something. No, there's no time to really go into this in any more detail.
We can continue the Ukraine discussion at the pub as well, but that one quickly.
Yeah, look, Ukrainians are getting billions and billions of dollars of arms, and it's escalating the war, and it's causing mass death and destruction. We should de-escalate the war by demanding the disarming of our own government, which is why we should be building a movement against AUKUS and against the own militaries and our own governments.
Surprising there's no interest in that. I'm bewildered by the lack of interest in what you're saying.
Well, there's a rally next weekend. You should be there, and so should everyone here. It's very important to fight militarism in our own country, because that's the main enemy is at home. It's a famous slogan. It's also like our rulers in NATO have no interest at all in self-determination for Ukrainians. So they support Israel to the hilt, an apartheid state. It's fairly well known now. Saudi Arabia, assault on Yemen's been every bit as barbaric as Russia's, but they're our allies, so we don't do anything about it. There's no principles in this. We need to be fighting for to reduce military spending wherever we are. Russia and NATO are both imperialist forces, and we should be fighting both of them, but above all our own military. That $170 billion that's going into the nuclear subs, imagine what that could do for our health system, our education system, a proper disability system. That's what we need to be fighting for, not for, pouring more arms into an already devastated area.
We'll get back to that at the pub.
Can I just say in response, Lachlan, you seem very uncomfortable about what you're saying, and I'm not surprised. And quoting our old mate Hegel, if something is abstract, it must be untrue. Philosophy is the enemy of the abstract. Philosophy returns to the concrete. And where did you leave the Ukrainian people? Hanging in an abstraction. Seriously, it's not good enough, and it is their rights that we need to prioritise, not fucking bloody Russian fascists. Anyway.
We can welcome them as refugees, as we should welcome all refugees, but there's not much.
We can put more pressure on NATO to bloody well supply more arms. Okay.
Let's continue that at the pub, seeing as we're only about 15 minutes left. But that's maybe a good topic for our next panel, which could be on Ukraine and the left. We had certainly panels in the United States and the UK on that exact topic. So maybe we'll readdress that in a future panel. Before I thank our speakers, I just wanted to remind everyone we're going to go over to the curtain across the road for drinks, and we'll probably be there till late and getting into all sorts of arguments. But one huge round of applause for all our participants today. Thank you.
Can I just leave one comment? I'm being self-indulgent, and people have been making comments on bureaucracy. Here is something this is a poem I've written on bureaucracy. It'll only take a minute. In medieval times, some theologians seriously debated how many angels could fit on the head of a pin. Their mistake can be found in their being insufficiently inclusive in their reckonings, for demons too can sit atop pins. Using their urge to torment and feed off human flesh, these demons embraced the modern world and mutated into bureaucrats. And each mutation mutated in turn, spawning managers, middle managers, human resources departments and regulations beyond measure. In honour of this spread, the mutants commissioned a great public work and constructed an invisible pin with an ever-expanding head.